Hello, and you are listening to Eco-Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco-Justice Radio acknowledges that we recorded this show on the traditional territory of the Ahachiman people and all of their relatives in the place we call Orange County, California. Welcome, I am Jack Ide. On today's show, Anthropause, the Beauty of Degrowth, we feature a conversation with author Stan Cox, newly retired Ecosphere Studies Fellow from the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. We also feature commentary on the Degrowth Movement from scholars such as Joan Martinez Alier, Jason Hickel, and Richard Wolff. Stan Cox is the author of 7 books, including Losing Our Cool, Uncomfortable Truths About Our Air-Conditioned World, Any Way You Slice It, The Past, Present, and Future of Rationing, and most recently, and the subject of today's discussion, Anthropause, The Beauty of Degrowth, available from 7 Stories Press. On today's show, we're talking about the movement towards degrowth, which should be placed in the context of an ecological reckoning for an ailing planet. Our war machine economy, led by Israeli-influenced politicians, are looking to invade Iran with boots on the ground. Don't forget Lebanon, too, after the bombing campaigns to get the oil and gas flowing again. This is a suicidal effort, okay? That's my opinion. And I hope I'm wrong. I want to be wrong, okay? Led by entimes, Christian and Zionist nihilists who pretend this violence-into-quagmire scenario might have some sort of rosy post-apocalyptic outcome. I don't know what they're thinking, and I can't wish them well. I really can't. Because how I wish them well is we find a way to not do any of that. And there's still a chance of that at this point. Yet there is another way. And this is more of the bigger way, not just the war question, but how we live our society. We cannot lose sight of what Henry David Thoreau understood well living under the trees around Walden Pond. Voluntary simplicity brings freedom. Frederick Nietzsche once wrote, "Blessed be a modest poverty. Consider the disasters wrought on us by a sort of dualism that separates human and nature, man and woman, white and non-white, normal and abnormal." Okay, the mountaintop being removed to seize the rare and non-rare earth minerals is the same as opening up your head to mine your consciousness to sell your ideas. You know, there's other ways than spilling the blood and poisoning the rivers to get at the wonders hidden in our land and body organism. Okay, consider how in the Peruvian Amazon, the Ashaninka people have been resisting extractivism by relying on Kametsa Aisake, a cosmovision that envisions the world as a network of mutually constituted human and non-human actors. Okay, this can get a little abstract and esoteric, and that's a bigger question. But to transfer out of this killing mode, which is not esoteric, is going to take some mental and physical work. I was looking into the indigenous Taiwanese concept of Gaga. Everything is connected. To take on the problems encountered by overpopulation, technology, capitalism. When the power of the wild gets a seat at the decision-making table, we will be forced to rethink everything. So that's what we're talking about today. How do we go from here, wars for oil and supremacy, climate collapse, massive strife between us and them, to there, retrofitting our cities and suburbs for ecologic health and human welfare, living interconnected, living together, and it's a cliche, but harmony, okay? That's what we're working for, and not the cliched version, but the real version. So here's a clip from BBC News called "Could Degrowth Save the World?"
So essentially it's how do we live well on this planet without destroying it? It's a simple question.
We are saturated, no, of all this information and of talking of the problem. How can we have spaces to look towards the solution?
We've all heard it before. To create a sustainable world, we must move away from fossil fuels and embrace green technology. But what if technology alone isn't enough?
People are dying, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
What if solving the issues of climate change demands a more profound systemic change? A group of activists and academics argue that infinite economic growth on our finite planet is a dangerous illusion. Their bold solution? Degrowth.
We are trying to teach people the importance of building social, economic, and environmental links with people around you.
So moving to this project gave me a lot of stability. I know that I'm going to have here 40 people that will be there for me.
It takes two kinds of work. No, it takes social, political, organization work, but also it takes a cultural shift.
Is it time to embrace more radical solutions, or are we risking too much?
All of our experience historically has been that if the economy shrinks for a period of time, that results in big increases in poverty.
I think degrowth underestimates the power of innovation. Degrowth underestimates the need for investment, and degrowth underestimates the social feasibility of what they propose.
There's no necessary contradiction between social and ecological objectives, but it does require a pretty radical transformation of the way we think about the economy and structure it.
In 1972, a group of researchers published a book titled The Limits to Growth. Their first conclusion was the following: if the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The book sparked a heated debate at the time, but also inspired a generation of scholars who started questioning the benefits of an ever-expanding economy. Professor Joan Martinez Alier is considered one of the godfathers of degrowth and the founder of the Barcelona School of Ecological Economics. He began writing about the links between the economy and the environment in the 80s.
Economic theory was based just on prices and market and not on the real substance of the economy, which is the material flows and the energy flows. So my book was doing a kind of history of these critiques of the economy, and it was the first book with the title Ecological Economics, because degrowth comes partly from ecological economics. Then in 2008, they had the idea of having in France a meeting in English about degrowth.
The Degrowth Movement, which began in France as Décroissance and was inspired by thinkers like Serge Latouche, is now spreading worldwide, becoming popular in countries like Japan, the UK, and Spain. In Barcelona, it is being embraced by academics, grassroots movements, and activists.
Degrowth is a radical proposal to, let's say, pull the emergency brake on a train that is going to the precipice. So it's a call to stop this pursuit of endless compound geometric growth for growth's sake. What isn't? It isn't like a call to destroy the economy. It's not a call for permanent recession. It's a call for doing things differently and in a way that human needs come first. Human and ecosystem needs.
So, welcome, Stan Cox, to Eco Justice Radio.
Great to be with you.
Yes, well, you've put out this pretty incredible piece of work, Anthropause, lining up sort of a way forward out of this mess that we keep just spiraling deeper into trouble. And the title, Anthropause, could you tell us where that came out of? What does it mean? A lot of people don't really know what you're getting at there.
Yes, I didn't know what Anthropause was myself when a couple of years ago, an editor calls up and suggested that I write a book with the title Anthropause. And I said, well, okay, let me look it up to see what it means. But it's really pretty fascinating phenomenon. It's the name given that ecologists gave to the time period in the spring and summer of 2020, when much of the nation and the world were under COVID lockdowns. And the ecologists immediately went out to study what the impact was out in nature, plants and animals that are not pets and not in our cultivated landscapes. And they saw a flourishing of nature. Not only did wild animals show up in downtowns of big cities and roaming on the highways and no roadkill, but carbon dioxide emissions plummeted around the world and in this country. People were in northern India who had never seen, the Himalayas were many hundreds of miles away from them, but they were able to see them because it was the first time that air pollution had cleared. The birds, a study of sparrows in San Francisco found that their song and more clear, more high quality as compared with before the Anthropause. And the idea was that without all that traffic background noise, that they were able to communicate in their normal way at about the level that they had back in the 1950s. And so it's amazing, many, many generations later, as soon as you turned the sound off, the background sound off, they were able to modulate their calls, improved mating success and so forth with higher quality calls. So anyway, I thought, well, that's not really the subject for a book, and a lot of experts in the area have written academic papers about it, but it would make a good opening parable for a book on degrowth, which, while I've been writing against perpetual growth now for about 20 years or so, but I had never written a book specifically regarding the degrowth movement, which in the United States anyway is kind of a new thing.
Yeah, well, it's sort of heretical.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so we've got the Anthropocene, the era of human dominance, and it just keeps getting uglier, out there. We've got a warmongering government of the United States, and there's conflicts being sprouted as we speak. There's just things are ramping up in multiple countries. Iran is the latest one, but even in what's happening here is there's a full frontal assault on the whole institutional state, the protection of the wild, the whole concept of climate disruption that is based in fossil fuel emissions that for years and years we've fought to get people to understand that this is a massive problem that we have to step up against. That is being eroded and questioned. There's a lot of people who talk about, this climate scam, all the while, right now the West is in a massive dry out, really high temperatures, and in the US it's crazy weather that's happening here. One thing I wanted to say about the COVID issue, there was a decrease of global carbon emissions. I think in your book you had 8.8% worldwide, which is massive considering how we keep escalating that percentage. This group here is a 350.org group, 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. We've been way past that. What are we at? About 415, 420, something like that.
Yeah, I think maybe even higher than
maybe even higher, exactly. But the problem that we had during COVID is even in personal consumption and the way people were acting was lowered, but the machines that run the world, whatever it is, there was still a massive amount of carbon being burned. So it's a tough thing to stop and to turn around. I think over the past 2 centuries, industrial, post-industrial enterprises, the degraded quality of life, we fix one thing and create new problems for ourselves. It's this sort of push-pull of capitalism, really. They improve people's lives, but then lives are made more difficult. how do we value nature? I think that's one question before we get into actual degrowth and sort of get into what you mean by that. How do we get people to understand what it should be right in front of their face, this love of nature, this need of nature? It's what brings us together. It gives us life, gives life to the birds, to the wild, to the trees. How do we get people to recognize that? Obviously, Eco Justice Radio, we recognize that here and we've been talking it, but in the world, we're going the wrong direction.
Yeah, that was part of my motivation for writing this book, because where the industrial society kind of walls us off from nature and people just tend to forget about it. So I asked the question, suggested a thought experiment, I guess, to what if our society, and it would be, it's kind of hard to imagine us doing it, but to answer this question, we have to just make an assumption that, okay, now we're in a future in which there has, for a number of years, there's been a cap on the total number of barrels of oil, cubic feet of gas, and tons of coal, which are allowed to be extracted and burned in, let's say, in the United States, and that cap is lowered every year. And of course, the central purpose of that would be to reduce CO2 emissions, but it would also force our economy to use not only fossil fuels, but other extracted resources first of all, to meet basic human needs. And then if whatever is left should not be used to simply for generating profit, but for meeting basic human needs even better. And my question then was, okay, if we have a society like that is just producing much less material stuff, is not wasting huge amounts of fuel on unnecessary transportation, a lot of other things that fuel is wasted on, and is behaving like what the degrowth movement is suggesting, then what benefits would we see? What is it that we have lost in this post-industrial world? What elements of nature have we lost that we didn't even realize? And what would be some of those benefits that would return, and how much better in many areas our quality of life would be when we reduce the exploitation of both the Earth's resources and also the exploitation of people.
Well, okay, so you put out in the book, you sort of lay it out in a way where you define the big problem and the big idea, which you're starting to get at in what you were just talking about in terms of putting an upper limit on material resource use and economic activity. I think Herman Daly was putting that out a long time ago, so this is not a new idea. Right. But could you talk about Georges Callas' vision, like defining degrowth? Because it's a negative term for some people, particularly those who growth at any cost is the way we're going. So how would you define degrowth, and as well as the thought leaders on what this is about?
Well, one thing they emphasize right at the top is that the degrowth idea is targeted at affluent, high-consuming, high-producing countries, with ours being prime example.
Top of the list.
Yeah, and because countries that are resource poor, there's a whole different development path that they need to take. And the top priority there is for the rich countries to stop exploiting their labor and resources and let them develop. So it's being done in countries like ours. And the goal, which is sometimes misunderstood because of the term degrowth, it's not that we just have policies that are directed at shrinking the gross domestic product or shrinking the amount of money in circulation. It's What is to be degrown is the throughput, you might say, of material and energy use in the accumulation of stuff and accumulation of waste to just downsize all of that in a very just and rational way, and in a way that ensures a very egalitarian way, because if you have less stuff, it needs to be spread around more evenly, and with small d democracy from the very local level to the top. And so basically steering the resources that are being used toward meeting basic needs. And maybe the slogan, sufficiency for all and excess for none.
Yeah, well, throughput, energy, materials, and waste flows. That's a big idea, considering it goes against the way we're operating now. We'll get to that question later. But there's a lot of people who say, look, all this degrowth stuff, how about let's just go with green growth? The technology can get us through. And actually, there's a lot of scientists and a lot of people out there who I do respect their work, who are trying to get us off fossil fuels onto cleaner fuels. Don't worry, we don't have to lose anything. The Rocky Mountain Institute and a lot of different people are putting out the technological way, even if it's green technology. What do you think of the green growth argument?
There was an economist back in the 70s, Herb Stein, who had something called Stein's Law, which was if something can't go on forever, it won't. And that's the situation with growth. There's nothing that can go on infinitely, and especially at a compounding rate over time. And Herman Daly, who you mentioned, recognized this a long time ago. So you can do things more efficiently, but efficiency can't bring this throughput of materials and energy down anywhere close to zero. And it can't bring the waste that's put into the atmosphere, land, and ocean down to zero.
Yeah, for sure.
So the degrowth people are saying that, look, growth is going to end no matter what. And if we carry on with business as usual, it will eventually, maybe not while we're alive, but when our children or grandchildren are, it's going to end in a vicious downward spiral of kind of a Mad Max world, probably, if we're just refusing to give up on growth. On the other hand, if we try to do it in a democratic, rational way, in ensuring that there's sufficiency for everybody, the future is going to be nothing like the present we have now, but what could be, it will be livable, and it could actually be a more livable future. And there was an interesting study recently in which the researchers asked, it was several thousand people in the US and the UK, and half of the people, they just asked them a simple question: what do you think of degrowth? And do you think that's a good idea? And not surprisingly, like 75% of people said, no, I want no part of that, because they have been told their entire lives that without growth, our whole way of life is going to fall apart, et cetera.
Well, but I need to interrupt you right there, just because we do need to take a break. So we will pick back up on this question after the break. We're talking with Stan Cox, and we'll be back in a sec. You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today you're listening to Anthropause, the Beauty of Degrowth. I'm your host, Jack Iden. We feature a conversation with author Stan Cox, newly retired Ecosphere Studies Fellow from the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. This is a clip, Can Degrowth Save the Planet? With Jason Hickel, economic anthropologist from the Autonomous University at Barcelona. Video presentation by Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Oslo.
It's pretty straightforward, actually, in a way. So the objective for pretty much anyone in environmentalist circles, I suppose, is more or less the same, which is to create an ecological economy, an ecological society. And this, of course, for rich nations, involves pretty significantly scaling down material use and obviously emissions, to achieve the Paris climate objectives. The observation that degrowth makes is simply that, yes, technology change is really important to this, and also efficiency improvements have to play a critically important role, and we need to accelerate processes of technological change and efficiency, and so on. But that alone is not going to be enough. What's also going to be necessary is to directly scale down certain forms of production, socially less necessary forms of production that are particularly destructive, particularly energy intensive, and we just don't need for the sake of human well-being, right? So there's huge chunks of our economy that are just irrelevant for well-being and mostly exist to serve the interests of capital accumulation and elite consumption. And it's simply the realization that in the middle of an ecological emergency, it is madness to continue devoting energy and materials to producing those things. So that's, I think, the main thing that kind of divides degrowth from green growth, right? I mean, degrowth is not an anti-technology position. It's a pro-technology position. It simply recognizes that technology alone is not enough, and yeah, we have to deal with the underlying production system. Now, it also differs, I have to say, from conventional mainstream bourgeois green politics, which tends to, A, not recognize the fact that we have to address the underlying economic system, which is capitalism, right? And then the second thing is that bourgeois green politics tends to sort of peddle in like narratives of guilt about individual behavior and overconsumption and so on. And that is, look, I mean, it has some traction, but clearly you can't build a mass political movement with a politics of guilt and so on. And plus, it's not ultimately consumption really that matters. What matters is the underlying, again, production system. Because a lot of people under capitalism have critical shortages of consumption of necessary goods, right? People who cannot access affordable housing, cities that don't have public transit, people who live in food deserts, et cetera, et cetera. And these problems are clearly not addressed by simply a politics of let's consume less, right? And so I think that we have to focus on the fact that we have a double crisis, a social crisis and an ecological crisis driven by the same underlying structural drivers. And we need a politics and a program that can effectively address both by reorganizing our system of production to produce to increase production of what we know is necessary for human needs and well-being and ecology, and reduce production of things that are not.
And here's another clip from Ask Professor Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus at UMass Amherst, on degrowth from Democracy at Work.
Jolene. And Jolene asks a simple question, but deceptively, as with most simple questions, there's a lot behind it. She asks, what is your opinion of the degrowth movement? So let me respond. Throughout the history of capitalism, there have been sensitive people who have noticed various kinds of irrationalities, things going on that they understand make no sense, or are destructive, or are unwanted, and they want to do something about it. It's a good and a positive, and it's a socially responsible impulse that they have, and so they get angry at that particular problem. One of them is the absurd focus on growth, the notion that every economy has to grow. Think about how often on the radio or television each of us hears some announcer say, the GDP grew X% per year in this place or that country or this period of time, as if a measurement of an economic system reduces to a measurement of how fast it grows. Think also about all the intelligent things that have been said about our economic system overusing the earth, the air, the water, and the purity that nature once gave all of those things. It's our growth that overfills our junkyards, that overexhausts where we dump our excess and our waste. And it has led sensitive, smart people to say, can we stop the growth? Can we slow the growth? Can we have a system, an economy, a society not fetishized around growth? The impulse is good. The idea, smart. But the solution, I don't think so. And let me explain why. Growth is the end result of something else. Basically, you have to ask yourself the question, why is every company, almost without exception, focused on growth? Let's make more profit. Let's take the profit and reinvest it in the company. The answer is not that individuals are born greedy. The answer is that's how the system works. If you make more profit and you use it to get better equipment or to hire more skilled workers or to use better inputs, you'll be more successful than your competitor. And the customers will come to you, not to your competitor. And you will succeed and your competitor will fail. And you don't want to fail. You don't want to be the competitor who fails. So you try to make as much profit as you can and plow it back into your business as much as you can, not because you're greedy, but because that's how you survive in a capitalist economic system. If you make a system work this way, that it rewards those who expand and grow and punishes those who don't, you can hardly be surprised if growth becomes a kind of crazy fetish that invades everybody's consciousness. So my reaction is, I want to say to the degrowth people, you're on to something, but you need to let your brain take you a bit further to understand why growth persists, why the efforts to stop growth don't seem to work, why the society is as freakishly focused on getting bigger now as it was 10, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 years ago. You have to recognize, as I think we have, that this capitalist system has as one of its many irrationalities growth built into its way of having folks survive in the core production of goods and services, organized as profit-making capitalist enterprises. That's the root of the problem.
Okay, we're talking with Stan Cox. I had to interrupt you there, talking about people's feeling that, wow, that term degrowth, that just sounds degrowth. That just sounds like I'm going to become shorter or I'm going to lose my house, or, it sounds like something scary, even to not just to the billionaires who are running the show, but it's really, they turn all the rest of us against these ideas because they sell this idea of abundance. And Ezra Klein and his team over there, they've been talking about abundance with regards to housing, but it's also been expanded out as sort of a smiley face to the green growth argument, but it has other elements to it. How do you look at all this?
Just going back to the survey I mentioned, in which indeed the word degrowth didn't poll very well at all. But that was one half of the people who were asked about it. The other half, surveyors described to them a degrowth society without, like the one that I've written about, without using the word degrowth. They just say there's more modest material abundance, but everybody has sufficient access to needs of life, including not only food and shelter, but good education, etc. There's sufficiency in the other degrowth policies. And in that case, instead of 3/4 being against the word degrowth, 3/4 were in favor of the elements of degrowth. Even climate policy researchers who were surveyed in another recent study, more than 80% of those who were given a choice of degrowth, no growth, or green growth, 80% chose either degrowth or no growth. Only 20% thought that green growth was a viable way forward.
Interesting.
So the abundance message is not going over very well, I don't think.
except maybe on social media. Although right now they're putting the back. They had some push there, and I had people who should know better, environmentalists who are telling me, you really need to think about this abundance message. Well, I think some of the big ideas that they talk about make sense, but when you drill down to what we really need to do and how effective they are, I think it's problematic. So Timothy Parikh explained that degrowth is intentionally provocative. Okay, so there's sustainable development or green economy advertise a certain vision of prosperity. So degrowth subverts it. It hijacks this notion of growth. So that there's a problem there in terms of how we talk about these things. But I'm interested in how you put, there's three different ways of going about degrowth. There's the environmentalist thing, we reduce, reuse, recycle, that type of mentality, which we agree with. There's the revolutionary, which is emancipation from ills. And then there's the utopian, redistributed goodness. Now, my website's called Wilder Utopia, so I'm not against all three of those. But what do you think about this three-tiered version, and how do you take on it? You obviously chose one of those for your book, but tell us about this push-pull.
Yeah, I think the original degrowth simply, which is a very simple idea, that we can't go on like this, and to have a livable planet, growth has to be reduced. That was the original idea. But then there was a realization that degrowth not only would improve the environment, it would also free us. It's, as Parikh called it, degrowth as emancipation, free us from the many terrible ills that a high fossil fuel, high material resource economy subjects us to. And then the degrowth people also saw it. As time went on, they emphasized more and more the governance part of it, egalitarian facets, the transformation of the workplace, the lack of exploitation, and so forth. So my book is focused mostly on the second, degrowth as emancipation, asking, okay, if we follow the degrowth path, what are the elements, both small and huge, of our current life that will necessarily be left in the past? Because if we're using fewer resources, we simply can't waste resources on those. So the rest of the book, starting with chapter 2, is kind of going through the catalog of these features of today's life in rich, affluent countries that we'll happily leave back in the trash can of history as we go into the future.
Well, I wanted to get to this question later as we unpack some of this, but it really is just coming up in my mind right now. Look, it's nice that you and I are having this conversation. We're right in so many different ways, but let's face it, how do we get from here to where we're talking about? And it seems completely utopian and in some ways diluted to have this conversation when really we don't even have, the 1970s institutional state that came about through Nixon's Environmental Protection Agency, which has been completely undone, and the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, these have been completely subverted. So why even talk about this? I mean, I agree with you. I'm talking devil's advocate here. What good are we doing by, I think we're planting seeds, but what's your way of looking at this question?
I agree with a lot of the degrowth thinkers that it's not going to work to depend on the economic and political power centers to bring about such a transformation. They're going to defend all this crap to the bitter end, that it has to be a groundswell from below, and people sort of beginning to build this new kind of society locally, but also being revolutionary in bringing it about at larger and larger scales. And people aren't going to get a popular movement like that really rolling. People aren't going to do it to get out in favor of building more solar farms or something like that. It's got to be the real degrowth message. And so my reasoning was, what will motivate people? And one thing is taking on the fossil fuel industries first, because everybody hates them except MAGA people who are in love with them. But more importantly, so that's kind of that first definition of degrowth. But the purpose of my book was to stress how much better a world it will be, and try to give it is a utopian vision of a world where people are valued as people. And there's not domination. We're not exploiting nature for profit and so forth. And as a result, we are living with far less, for example, noise and light pollution. We're not fighting wars. We're not in continuous military mode because we won't be able to afford $1 trillion Pentagon budgets and so forth. And we're not going to have a society that is kind of sinking under the weight of unnecessary material abundance. So I think before the process of getting to that kind of world can start, people need to be thinking about a goal like that is going to be better for everybody and will avoid this Mad Max future that we're going to end up in otherwise.
So I just wanted to break in because we recorded this interview before the war broke out. So I think that some of the points that we're making about a war for oil, about the actual cost, the economic devastation of war in general, but the Iran war, experts warn of a massive wave of inflation coming from the Gulf, not just oil, but gas supply chains for microchips, fertilizers, farming are collapsing. The West cannot survive. Okay? We can't survive. We haven't prepared properly. Here, this is from the BBC.
It's been going on now for 3 weeks. It's clearly disrupted markets. It's already filtering through to inflation. The way to think about this is a wave of inflation is coming from that Gulf where the ships aren't getting out. But now I think you have to sort of start to think of the contingencies if it does last for 3 months. So we would see that in the potential domestic energy prices, which are going down on April the 1st, but that would clearly change in July. They're trying to work out what the scope of any intervention could be. And right now, we think that would be targeted and not a general package that we saw in 2022. But you've got to think about the other economic supply chains, unexpected, not just oil and gas, things like helium for chips, things like urea for fertilizer and for farming. All of this becomes much more severe an issue the longer it goes on. And that's where it looks.
So when you fight wars for oil, there's all these secondary impacts that we just heard about that leak into all sorts of things. Was the war only fought for oil? Was it fought for Israel? Both. For geopolitical supremacy, for having control of what people consider people of this warmongering imperialist nation of the United States as a country that won't comply and they need to show their supremacy. Yeah, well, it has secondary effects. And right now, the U.S. is so desperate to lower oil prices, they're lifting sanctions on Russia and Iran, begging China for help, begging Europe to come in and join them, or anyone, please come help us. It's really sad what's going on. Talking about sending ground troops to occupy Karg Island, which is, we just pray that they don't do this, although there have been reports that ground troops are en route. Instead of coming up with a way, whatever way to slip out of this war and end it, they're going to make the mistake, really, a truly horrific mistake. And so when we talk about degrowth, these type of considerations never come up because we're living within our means. We're not trying to do things that should not be done. We're not trying to take things through might. We're accepting that certain things are the way they are, and respecting boundaries, respecting other people, respecting other nations, and we're learning how to work together. How do we get a society that is based around that? Because a society that learns that lesson is a society that will last, a society that considers warmongering and this geopolitical supremacy through might and blowing up people, murdering people en masse with this absolute violence. That society won't last. And the United States and Israel are facing, some real impacts to who we, the United States, are today. It's going to change. They're cooked. Well, I was struck by something you said in the beginning there that was sort of happening when there was an industrial drawdown or lower during COVID, how the birds were singing in a way they hadn't sang or hadn't been heard. To me, I think that humans might start singing too in a way they hadn't heard. I mean, understanding, it's kind of like when you go on vacation to the mountains, you go up and feel completely restored by the wild energy up there. And yeah, you got your car stuck in the mud and it was cold, but you really feel enlivened by that wild thing. So there's some sacrifices to go into the wild to be more connected to the environment. And that's part of what this fossil fuel economy was built around, to make your neighborhood safe and create places where, they redirected the water so the floods wouldn't happen, and the roads were built so you could live in a place with trees around it instead of high-rise buildings. But we've created this monster, and we'll get into the details of how you break it down, because I think it's really interesting and would be good for the audience to hear more about the different things. But I mean, okay, so we stop the barrels of oil, keeping the machines moving, gas, this whole push that we have with the liquefied natural gas. We're trying to supply the world with more of these fossil fuels. They're emptying out the hillsides of oil and gas in Texas and New Mexico. This whole economy, it's enriching some, but really we're seeing what's happening with the climate. We're seeing complete devolving of the systems that really protect us, that the climate where, these heat waves that we're experiencing, the no rain, the droughts that we're going through, this whiplash effect that one day, we went for a whole year almost with very little rain, and then all of a sudden we have rain that is 10 times the normal. So how to get from here to there is a question, but I think we do need to take a break, so we will be back in a sec. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests, listen to extended episodes, and get connected with us on social media. Today you're listening to Anthropause, the Beauty of Degrowth. I'm your host, Jack Ide, and we feature a conversation with author Stan Cox, newly retired Ecosphere Studies Fellow from the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. And here is Jason Hickel again. Socialism should be our rallying cry on Novara Media's Downstream podcast.
The things that degrowth calls for cannot happen within capitalism. It's antithetical to capitalism. And in fact, this is the reason why degrowth gets so much hate. It's interesting. I had a conversation with a leading figure of degrowth recently, and I was like, well, we actually should stop using the term because people hate it. And he was like, you have to understand, people don't hate it because it sounds negative. They hate it because they can see that it's anti-capitalist. They hate it because it's very apparent that this is against the interests of capital accumulation and, furthermore, requires democratic control over production and planning, right? Because you're going to have to plan the downscaling of some forms of production and the upscaling of others. This cannot occur under capitalism as we know it. And so that's why there's a backlash from the right. And so I think that given that fact, what we actually want to do is play into that terrain more directly. Like, let's rid ourselves of the confusion. This is really about class struggle. This is really about who controls the means of production. Quite. And so let's make the movement actually is socialism. Yeah. We have to build a movement for socialism that has the possibility of taking power and overcoming capitalist control of production, asserting democratic control over our own productive capacities so that we can address our social and ecological crises. That's the movement. That's the objective. I think that degrowth is properly understood as a piece of socialist transformation that applies specifically to rich countries. And again, I think one of the major misunderstandings of degrowth, and this is another reason why it triggers so much anger, is that people immediately think, oh, this is about denying development to the global south. No, it is fundamentally the opposite of that. It is specifically targeted at those nations that dramatically overshoot their planetary boundaries and have to reduce material and energy use to achieve sustainability. That does not apply to countries in the imperial periphery, where we know that in most cases, they need to increase their use of energy and resources to build out the infrastructure necessary to ensure good lives for all, right? So that entails aggregate increasing production, in other words, growth. Of course, a socialist development project in the periphery, like in China now, should not target growth for its own sake, but should target the necessary forms of production for human well-being. And right now, in most global south countries, that would entail an aggregate increase in production. So that's the key, I think. I think that the socialism is the main objective here and should be our rallying cry.
All right, so we're back with Stan Cox talking about how we get from here to there from the Anthropause book here that sort of charts a vision, because we really do need a vision. We really need to sort of see the way through how to get a hold of this industrial society to, make it serve people and communities and ecosystems and become a better world here. So another example that you use, that you take a bunch of examples of things that would change under this vision that you lay out. And the minimizing energy will require putting artificial light indoors and out on a massive diet. And our nighttime sky, I've lived out in Central and South America in places with no electricity, and can vouch for it was a complete revelation to be introduced. Now, it's not just like when you go once again, that camping image, I'm up in the mountains and you can see the stars and you go, oh, wow. It goes much beyond that. Those people who study the stars, even those who argue that the stars affect the way we live and the way we think and the way we live our lives and what level of star that we're born under, these things become clearer to you because when you're in a place where you expect the stars, they're constantly in rotation. You know what phase the moon is. You know whether you're going to be able to see at night. It's a whole different way of living that we have lost in today's world. And interestingly, from far away, when I came back, this was in Honduras. I was living out in La Mosquitia, Honduras, and places no electricity. And when I was coming back to the electrified side of Honduras, we were off the coast of Trujillo, and we looked at Trujillo, and there was this white cap over the town that they're living in their own little version of, and we were living in the world. So I think that's a real, your section talking about artificial lighting, getting rid of that is really pretty powerful.
Yeah, and this disappearance of the night sky or bleaching of the night sky has happened at a remarkably fast rate since, starting in about 2010, the amount of what's called sky glow, which is the bleaching out of the sky from outdoor artificial lighting. The sky glow, which makes the stars disappear, has been increasing at 10% per year over the past 15 years. And it's inadvertently was partially caused by efforts to improve energy efficiency, because it was over those same years when the mass adoption of LED lighting came about, in which you get more light for the same amount of energy. But instead of using LED street lights, advertising, stadium lights, and so forth, instead of using it to reduce energy consumption for the same amount of light, the municipalities, companies said, okay, we'll use the same amount of energy and then we can really have a lot of light. And that has had a lot of serious consequences, both for the non-human world. The ecological consequences for all kinds of species have been bad, including the disappearance of fireflies, lightning bugs. You just don't see as much. And there are a lot of excessive light at night as causes a whole bunch of human health problems. And then, as you said, the social, cultural, intellectual, scientific quality of life has been, throughout human history, has been enhanced by the vision of the night sky. And most of the people of the world now just don't have that. And it's not like climate change, which is going to take that carbon is going to be in the atmosphere for a long time. In this case, we could bring back the night sky just like that by not wasting so much electricity on producing all that light.
Yeah. Okay. How do we get rid of air conditioning in a rapidly heating world?
Now, that was one of my first books. The whole thing was on air conditioning. And, at the time, back then in the 20-teens, it was a lot easier then to talk about, how you can be just as comfortable with open windows and so forth. It's it's getting harder all the time. And
it is.
More and more, when I'm talking about it, I have to say, look, I'm not saying to not use air conditioning during these extreme heat waves, but that there still is, and depending on where you live, there's a lot of the year that is warm or even a little hot that is perfectly safe and can be perfectly comfortable if you don't use air conditioning and your body adapts to not using it. Not when it's 98 or 105, but on a nice 83-degree summer evening, if you're in the shade with a breeze or a fan and so forth. Life is better without it.
Yeah. Well, I was talking about living down in Central South America. I was living in Haiti for a while. It was very hot there, and they have these cement buildings that sort of amplify that heat, and there's and often there would be no electricity, so you couldn't even have a fan. But you know what? You get used to these things now. For elder people with health issues, it's harder to get used to. So there are issues. So that's one of those things that society adapts when these problems are presented. But I think for the remaining time, because there's some bigger issues that you cover in the later part, you've got the transportation side as well as the agricultural side. So we won't have enough time to sort of unwrap what there. So we recommend that people go out and read this book, and because it really can get your mind thinking. But so how do we get off the road to nowhere? And because I think that's a really important thing. You start off with Andre Gorse's version of the automobile. You want to start with that and bring us?
Yes, the Austrian philosopher Andre Gorse in the early 2000s. In a book of his, he had a chapter about the automobile and said something like, the private car is akin to a villa on the Riviera. It only is of value to you. It only makes your life better if you're one of a very small number of people who have one. Speaking of the automobile, once it's totally democratized and everybody has one, everybody is out there on the road making each other's lives miserable. And there's not only the misery of driving and traffic and road rage and so forth, but we have a true epidemic of pedestrian deaths in this country. It have risen like over recent 10-year period, increased by 70%. And the number of pedestrian deaths caused by large SUVs and large pickup trucks increased twice that fast. They increased by 140% because those heavier, taller, faster vehicle will kill a person much more easily than a small car. So there's a lot more to say about the concretization of cities and suburbs ruining
sprawl,
quality of life.
Sprawl and never not being able to walk anywhere. We're addicted to these machines. We have to jump in and drive to pick up a loaf of bread. Actually, running into humans is often not common in our neighborhoods. I don't know. It's so as an urban planner, I've been wrestling with this transportation dilemma for a long time. So there's a lot more to say, but we'll just leave it at that. But what about EVs? Are they an alternative? I mean, maybe we should just electrify everything.
The reason, of course, that they're a big focus of the green growth movement is that they don't have tailpipe emissions. They don't even have a tailpipe. But as things stand now, the electricity they run on, a large share of that is still produced with fossil fuels. And then if you take not only the climate impact of the fuel that the EV is burning, but you add in the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced in manufacturing it and going all the way back to China or Chile or wherever the lithium and cobalt from Congo and so forth, where all that comes from, and the other industrial processes, they account for a lot more global warming than the production of a gas-powered car does. And then you have the waste disposal and the huge problem of the batteries. And then with the pedestrian death problem, these batteries are so big and huge. Like the electric F-150, the battery weighs, I think, a ton and is the size of 2 mattresses. But EV electric Hummer, the battery weighs as much as my gas-powered Honda Civic, the whole car. And that makes them much more deadly if they hit you.
Yeah, it's funny that these green growth options, these abundance options, come up because those of us, myself included, who were arguing against fossil fuels, we need to stop fossil fuels, and people, well, what is your alternative? And we're often pressed to suggest an alternative that people today would say, well, that sounds good, instead of like completely saying, look, let's step back and revision the world that we live in, and what is important to you, and what is important to your community, and what is important to your survival in the community, and what is your connection to the wild and the wild forces and the sun and the moon. So we suggest these things like EVs, which sound pretty good when we're heated, telling them to stop drilling in the wild here, but they create all these massive problems. And I've spent a good portion of the last 2 years down in Chile investigating areas where they're searching out rare earth minerals like lithium, which is massive, integral to those batteries. So it's problematic. We'll leave it at that. We've only got a couple minutes here in terms of our show and our radio audience, as well as our podcast. And you got a whole big section, which this show spends a lot of time talking about, is rethinking how we treat the land, the agricultural production, this concept of how we live off the land, how it creates the food, but how, we have industrial agriculture model, which is extremely destructive. And so, just real quick, because we'll just give us the quick concept that you did there, and people will have to read your book.
Well, the experts on this who a few years ago said, okay, what is it about agriculture? If you wanted to have the biggest impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what would you stop doing? And the answer was you would get rid of grain-fed beef, have no more feedlots, whatever animals are produced are living on grass. And so that would mean you stop growing huge quantities of corn and soybeans, and then you would get rid of fuel, ethanol. You would stop turning corn into
fuel,
car fuel. 90% of our agricultural farmland in the United States is devoted to 4 crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton. And only one of those wheat is the only one that's predominantly eaten by humans. And we have to, we need the cotton, but wasting the corn and soybeans and wasting the topsoil in which they're grown would be the top priority.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more to say about this and talking about restoration of ecosystems and I think there's a lot of important things that could come about because of, if we adopt this concept of anthropause. I would even go beyond. Pause sounds like it's a temporary thing, and we'll get back to the fossil fuels and the wars and the rare earth mineral rush. We need a revision that goes beyond just pause. I know that it's just a title, and I'm not criticizing it. I think it's a great title. We're over time here, but we go a little over in our podcast. And so I'll ask you just one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. There were intentional communities in the 60s and 70s. There were these things going on a lot earlier than that. But in the more recent culture, this whole concept of hippie communes, there was one big one in Tennessee. There were a lot of them in California out here. There's a lot of different visions that people had to create because, okay, we can't change the whole United States, but what if we just changed a small community? And those tended to rip apart because a lot of people were looking out at the bigger world and saying, well, look how well they're living out there, and here we're suffering, What do you think of that movement? And, is it possible to do a smaller version of this rather than changing the Western countries and their capitalist intentions?
Yeah, I think if there is going to be a transition to green growth, there's going to be a lot of that. It's not necessarily the mechanism that's going to bring about this new future, but it's going to be one of the ways that people find to live with fewer resources. It's a bit old-fashioned technologically, but I would recommend and I'm sure, Jack, that you read it at some point, the novel Ecotopia. I think Fred Kallenbach, was the author.
Yeah, I definitely read it in college, in university.
But he tried, his thought experiment was that the states of the West Coast secede from the United States and then build a society like what you're talking about. And there are things that are naive in there, and so forth. But in general, it's interesting to see somebody just saying, okay, what might it look like if we were to do this?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's a difficult vision to really put into reality as we stand here. But I think that there is a pretty strong appetite, as some of the studies showed, if it was talked about in its real frame. So I thank you for writing this book, and you've done a lot of great work putting out in the world big ideas to try and change, to try and shift the direction of this messy industrial whatever we are. Dying empire is the way that we're operating today, and it's getting uglier and uglier as days go on. How can people buy your book and find out more about your work that you're doing and your writing? You're publishing in a lot of different journals and magazines and different places. Tell us how we can get in touch with you.
It's published by 7 Stories Press, and you can get it at just about any book outlet is carrying it. I personally wouldn't buy it from Amazon, but just
good,
about
good
it.
advice. Good advice.
There's one good site, bookshop.org or bookshops, plural.org, and part of their earnings are distributed to local bookshops. So that's one good place.
Yeah, that's great. So they can look you up. Do you have a website that you have personally, or?
I would just look at sevenstoriespress.org.
Okay, that'll have all your links.
Look for my name.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with our audience and share the really great work and important visioning. So thanks for coming on Eco Justice Radio today.
Well, thanks for all you're doing, Jack.
Yeah. Thank you to Stan Cox, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Anthropause, The Beauty of Degrowth. For an extended version of the show, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Eco Justice Radio, SoCal 350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard, you want others to be informed, subscribe and share the episodes. You've been listening to Eco Justice Radio, a project of SoCal 350. Executive producer and co-host myself, Jack Eit, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.